Hello and welcome to our next session. I am Parvez Khan. I am an assistant professor in the Department of Journalism and Mass Communication, Kohat University of Science and Technology. The subject is Media Laws, Ethics and Literacy. The course code is JMC 351. It's our lecture number 17, which is Free Speech and Stable Society. So today we'll be discussing free speech in detail, its implications, its need for civil society, the importance of it in democratic terms. This is what we're going to talk about today, but also some considerations regarding free speech, which is equally important for journalists and citizens. So we'll be talking about the objectives of this session today. Students will be able to understand the concept of free speech in stable society. They will be able to understand that ordinary citizens have rights when it comes to expressing themselves, and free speech encourages democratic norms. But we must also not forget that freedom and responsibility is equally important, and there's a lot of responsibility when there's a need to talk about freedom as well. So there's a responsibility at hand that needs to be considered as well. So, freedom of speech. What is freedom of speech? Well, obviously, it's in general terms when you speak about the freedom of speech, it just tells you that you're free to express yourself, you're free to talk about yourself. But in general terms, you can call it an indivisible right, which forms a basis of all other human rights and measures the effectiveness of the laws. Obviously, it's the basis of the all other human rights. It's one of the basic rights that humans have to be able to express themselves. And freedom of expression constitutes one of the essential foundations of a democratic society and one of the basic conditions for its progress and for each individual's self fulfillment. What is it? So let's look into the dictionaries, how they define it. It's like the power or the right to express one's opinion without censorship, restraint, or legal penalty. A very important point when you're able to express yourself without any censorship, without any restraint or legal penalty. That's freedom of expression. It's a very good definition because what you're saying is not being censored, no one is stopping you from doing, and then there's no legal penalty. This is to some extent a very good definition of freedom of speech. And now let's look at how Merriam Webster Dictionary defines it. These are two definitions that we're going to talk about. It's basically the legal right to express one's opinion freely. So Oxford and Webster, they're just giving some definitions, but they give a very strong point that obviously freedom of speech is more about the ability to express yourself. It's about your opinions that goes without censorship, restraint, or legal penalty, that you can say whatever is important. You have the right as a citizen to express your grievance. You have the right to criticize if anything's wrong. This is what the freedom of speech is all about. And then freedom of speech is the right to seek, receive, and impart information and ideas of all kinds by any means. This is another explanation of freedom of speech, and freedom of speech and the right to freedom of expression applies to the ideas of all kinds, including those that may be deeply offensive. But it comes with responsibilities, and we believe that it can be legitimately restricted. So yes, that's an important point because often people raise a point that if everyone is allowed to say everything, that would create a very chaotic situation that can be problematic, that can lead to differences, that can lead to riots, violence. But yes, obviously, freedom of speech gives you the right to speak, give the right to express. Sometimes it can be deeply offensive, but it comes with responsibilities and it can be legitimately restricted as well. For example, if you are going to say something or if an individual is going to harm some vulnerable groups, it can be restricted, it can be challenged. Similarly, there are many other issues associated with, we'll talk about it. So let's talk about the conditions. And some of the conditions are that governments have an obligation to prohibit hate speech and incitement. For example, if there is someone who goes out and he has a lot of public influence. For example, in the history, we could see that in some countries or some groups, if they are trying to incite violence against a vulnerable group of people, if they're going to say anything that is dangerous enough, governments can they can come in and they can intrude and they can stop them from doing so. These are some of the conditions that you can stop it. And restrictions can also be justified if they protect specific public interest or the rights and reputations of others. And similarly, any restrictions on freedom of speech and freedom of expression must be set out in laws that must in turn be clear and concise so everyone understands them. This is a very important point that yes, there are ways to restrict freedom of speech, there are ways to restrict freedom of expression through laws, and it must be clearly, explicitly written because obviously you cannot stop individuals if they are criticizing government officials if something is wrong, because at the end of the day, the government servants are responsible for public or whatever is happening. And if public have grievances regarding municipality or the problem in their areas or health or anything, they have every right to speak. But if there's something that is going to incite violence, if something that's going to cause destruction, that's something going to cause problem to national security, then it must be set out in clear terms. Ambiguity is basically going to create more problems. Ambiguity in law, particularly, is aimed at curtailing freedom of speech. That can be another big problem. So instead of curtailing, the laws must in turn be clear and concise so that everyone could understand them because at the end of the day, freedom of speech is important for upholding law, for democratic norms, for stability of society. It's very, very important. Then obviously people imposing the restrictions, whether they are government employees or anyone, must be able to demonstrate the need for them and they must be proportionate. The key word here is proportionate. It means that it should be balanced enough. It should not be biased. If you're stopping someone from freedom, if you are curtailing someone's freedom, you need to have a legitimate answer to that. You must be explicitly clear on why you're doing, why you're stopping the individual or groups from expressing themselves. This is very, very important because at the end of the day, freedom of speech is very important if it's meant to, if it's linked to human rights and all these issues. And all of this has to be backed up by safeguards to stop the abuse of these restrictions and incorporate a proper appeals process. This is very important. For example, you found out some anomalies or you found out some issues with a particular problem. If you stop someone from delivering their speech, if you found out you stopped something, but there should also be an appeals process because at the end of the day, we are looking for improving the system. And this is what brings us to checks and balances. Why checks and balances are important as well. Any restriction should be specified as possible because it would be wrong to ban an entire website because of a problem with one page. Let's not be cruel enough. Restrictions should be specific. National security and public order, these terms must be precisely defined in law to prevent them being used as excuses for excessive restrictions. These are the two words that can be used for excessive restrictions on public, and therefore the law must be clear and when and how the freedom of speech can be curtailed and why. Because there needs to be very good and profound reason for it. It should not be used as an excuse for excessive restrictions. Then obviously we talk about the morals. This is a very subjective area, but any restrictions must not be based on a single tradition or must not discriminate against anyone living in a particular country. And the rights and reputations of public officials, they should be able to tolerate more criticism than private individuals, and defamation laws that stop legitimate criticism of a government or public official often violate the free speech. So what it means that the government officials should often be ready for criticism because that's their job. They have to be answerable. They have to let people know they are in a position where they can be criticized and it must not be taken offensively. This is the problem with some of the developing economies in the world. When you criticize an official, when you criticize a particular person or related to a powerful group, what happens that the defense brigade, they come up, they give excuses. That should not be the case. It should be taken as genuinely because people have the right to question. And if something is wrong, that should be addressed legally. That's the issue. And in this context, it's equally important to talk about media and journalists in general. That media and journalists and bloggers face particular risk because of the work they do. So, countries therefore have a responsibility to protect their right to freedom of speech. Restriction on newspaper, TV stations can affect everyone's right to freedom of expression. So, it's very important to understand that press needs to be free. Press needs to be operating free. They need to cover stories so that the voice, the public image can be shared. Because what is press or what is journalism is basically the reflection of society. So if press is not free, if press is curtailed, that means that public doesn't have the right to express themselves. So as long as press is not free, you cannot talk and you cannot say that there's freedom of expression. So if you want to know about the freedom of expression, the level that the freedom each country gives, you can guess it from the restriction on press. It's equally important to give a lot of press freedom so that the issue of freedom of expression is addressed. Because press shares stories, the public views, they come up, there's a reflection of society. So the freedom of press is instrumental when we talk about freedom of expression. And then there are whistleblowers. Government should never bring criminal proceedings against anyone who reveals information about human rights abuses. This is a very important point. Whistleblowers are the key. They expose corruption, they expose something wrongdoings. And what happens is mostly when we see these whistleblowers, they get punished, and the problem is that then they keep in hiding, and that becomes they get in exile. So this kind of issues is happening even in the most developed countries, because if they let people know about something, they have a price to pay. But that shouldn't be the case, because if they're exposing corruption, if they're exposing some wrongdoings and something, it should not be considered as a threat. It should not be considered a danger in part of the government operations or whatever it is. It's a serious issue, and whistleblowers needs to be protected by law as well, because at the end of the day, they're also contributing in improving the system. But that doesn't happen, and often we see that whistleblowers pay a big price. And then obviously, rights and responsibility. Free speech is one of our most important rights and one of the most misunderstood. It comes with a great deal of responsibility. So, all I can say is that use your freedom of speech to speak out for those that are denied theirs, but use it responsibly. It's about responsibility that you have, that you should use freedom of expression with a great deal of responsibility. That's important. But at the end of the day, it's also about challenging those in power, challenging abuses, challenging human right abuses, issues related to, when you speak about that, that's what you should do. But you should also look into ethical considerations. You should also look at the legal perspective. And that's important as well. But let's look at it from a different perspective as well, that it's also a marketplace of ideas, freedom of speech, marketplace of ideas. The more the pluralistic society is, the number of ideas that keep pouring in, you have different visions and different mindsets that exist in a culture. That gives you a lot of strength. So, freedom of expression contributes to the marketplace of ideas, a concept which is popularized by John Stuart Mill, very famous his ideas, and this is also related to him. But freedom of expressions and marketplace of ideas is the key word here, and ideally allowing individuals to voice diverse and even controversial ideas. And since opinions lead to desirable and vetted socio-political solutions. So the more you have the ideas, the more diverse opinions are there, the more discussions takes place, it leads to a progressive society. And this is why it leads to desirable and vetted socio-political situations. What do you mean by vetted? Obviously, you know at hands. You have so many opinions. You have so many voices, and you can vet. You can take it out. You can take out some of the socio-political solution at hands. You know what the problem is. You can be in the people's mind. You can read them properly, and it helps you understanding them for solutions purposes. And then this permits people to air their grievances and work as a pressure release valve, helping to curb violent uprising by the population. What freedom of speech does, that it permits people to air their grievances. This is a very important point. And it works as a pressure release valve. Because remember, if people are suffering, if there are human right abuses, or there are some critical issues, and you're not addressing them and you're not allowing them to speak, that enhances the pressure. It works like a pressure cooker and it bursts in the end. So what democratic society do, that they give several platforms, they let people to assemble, they give allow them the freedom of speech, and it helps curb the violent uprising of the population. This is very important. Normally in our the countries of South Asia, the South Asian countries, we usually adopt violent means to silence people if there is a political uprising or anything. But it's important to understand that if you allow people to speak, if you allow them to share their grievances, it works much better. This is why freedom of speech is so important, despite the fact that we are normally seeing that the kind of grooming, the kind of political culture we live in, it is normally said that no, if you allow people to speak, it's dangerous, it's this and this is that. But remember, freedom of speech, when you allow people to share their grievances, it works a lot better rather than suppressing them, which can lead to violent uprising. Then, freedom of press propositions closely link media freedoms with democracy development as well as socio-political stability. Obviously, freedoms is linked with democratic development and socio-political stability. This is our topic of the day today as well. That freedom of speech is essential. It leads to societal stability and it also leads to socio-political stability. This is very important. Why the need? Because it's a fundamental need. It enforces all other human rights. It's essential for social change. It's not about speaking, but also about being heard. Because at the end of the day, you just don't want to speak. You want to hear the grievances. You want to know what others are saying. And this is how progressive society works. And this is how development takes place. And this is what democracy is all about. So advantages, it leads to economic growth, obviously, because you have pluralistic ideas, you have new markets, you're open to different kinds of opinions. That leads to economic growth. It ensures democratic spirits, and obviously it leads to socio-political stability. So these are some of the key advantages. And I'll look into considerations, why some of the considerations are important. That freedom of speech comes with a great deal of responsibility. It does not mean that what you think is the only true version of reality. You must look into it. You must speak, but you must also hear. Verification is the key. What you're stating, what you're reflecting must be verified. Freedom of speech comes with responsibility. Facts must be stated correctly. It's not just that you come out and accuse someone of corruption and you don't have facts to verify. Then you must look into vulnerable groups in society. Each country, each continent, each group has a place where there are some vulnerable people that you need to look into. And it's very important to look into that from perspective of democracy and all that, because the groups must be protected. You cannot just go out and target people. You must take care of them as well. And then question power when this unlawful activity, when you see, because standing truth to power is the most difficult thing, but this is what journalists do. They ask tough questions. When they're unlawful, they must be questioned, but still, a lot of caution must be taken. And the important point here is transparency. It leads to a lot of development. Everything is clear, and transparency is very important when it comes to freedom of speech and responsibility. So some of the questions that we need to look into: how important is freedom of speech? How do you see Pakistan in this context? Does it promote democratic norms? Your opinion? Have you seen any stories in Pakistan where freedom of speech was violated? Or have you seen any story abroad that you think the freedom of speech saved one? So how important is freedom of speech? So this is what majorly our topic for today. So I hope that you discussed and you enjoyed. I hope you enjoyed the session today, not discussed, but I hope you really enjoyed the session today. It's more about freedom. It's a complicated topic. It's not easy, particularly in the socio-political circumstances the world is in today. The more you speak about freedom, the more it's curtailed. The more you talk about freedom, It's about less responsibility. People act less responsible. So remember, freedom of speech is the key. It's very important. As a journalist, everyone would highly advocate freedom of speech, but it comes with a lot of responsibility as well. Responsibility is the key word we must never forget. Because if you are exploring a corruption story, if you're excusing or accusing someone, it needs to be backed with verifiable facts. Facts are very important. You must verify it. Without that, it can lead to a lot more problems. It can lead to serious defamation suits as well. So, as a journalist, we must look into it. As a journalist, it's our right, it's our formal goal to uphold democracy and truth and democratic norms. And for that, freedom of speech is essential. Thank you very much for joining our session today. Looking forward to another session. I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you very much. Have a great day.